Welcome to Mini Scandals, the series where we roll an investigation check on the scandals and drama that grip the world's hobbies, niches and interests. Dungeons and Dungeons and Dungeons and Dragons, also known as D&D, and D&D, is the legendary tabletop role-playing game that has captured the hearts, minds and virginities of its obsessive player base. First released in the mid-70s, it has slowly crept its way from the basements of men still living with their parents well into their 30s to the basis of the highest earning Twitch channel. However, this meteoric rise wasn't without its share of adversity, and our favourite murder hobo simulator has been blamed for inciting everything from prison escapes to Satanism to more than a few deaths. I'm gonna need everyone to roll initiative because it's time for the mini scandals of Dungeons and Dragons. Parents looking for an easy solution to their troubled child's problems that doesn't involve taking any responsibility themselves have often blamed the new and unknown. Whether it's violent video games, that dang rock and roll music, or Colosseum gladiator fights. In the mid-70s, Dungeons and Dragons rolled its way onto the dorm room tables usually reserved for beer pong and premarital sex, and parents were immediately concerned. By D&D, I mean, that other stuff was fine. The first victim of Dungeons & Dragons was a teenager named James Dallas Egbert III. James was a child prodigy who enrolled at university at just 16 years old, yet despite this impressive feat, was still under immense pressure from his parents to succeed academically. This, coupled with epilepsy, a drug addiction, and the possibility he was coming to terms with his homosexuality in an environment that was hardly accepting, led him to attempt suicide in the steam tunnels below his university. When this failed, he went into hiding, and it was during this time that PI William Dare was hired to try and find him. Through rumours dredged up from university students, as well as Dare's unfamiliarity with D&D, one of his early theories was that Egbert had taken to playing Dungeons & Dragons in the steam vents below the university and somehow got lost. Interestingly, it appears that students actually did carry out fantasy roleplay in the steam vents, but of course that isn't D&D, it's LARPing. Lightning bolt! Yet the simple-minded folks of the 1970s were quick to lump anything fantastical together, in the same way that your mum still calls every console a Nintendo. Dare's Steam Vents and Dragons hypothesis was quickly made the focal point of the case by the media, and the idea of America's youth being so absorbed by role-playing games that they lose touch with reality was ingrained in the nation's collective consciousness. This unfounded fear was even coalesced into a work of fiction imaginatively titled Mazes and Monsters, about an obsessive RPG player having a psychotic breakdown and believing he's now his character. This novel was even adapted into a made-for-TV movie of the same name, featuring a 26-year-old Tom Hanks in his first leading film role, weirdly enough.
I have spells. I'm going to fly.
You don't have enough points. I am the maze controller.
Ironically, the pearl-clutching suburbanite mothers of America were unable to distinguish between fantasy and reality, and many interpreted the events in the book as realistic depictions of how Dungeons & Dragons is played and what it might lead to.
I have spells.
Tragically, Egbert's story doesn't have a happy ending, worsened by the media ignoring a discussion around the real but apparently boring story of mental health issues and substance abuse, in favour of vilifying one of the few things that likely gave this teenager a temporary escape from his troubles. Okay, that last one got a bit heavy, so let's take a quick breather and take a look at something a bit less depressing. The American justice system. Oh, wait. Dungeons & Dragons may as well have been made for prisoners. You're stuck in a room for most of the day with nothing to do but create elaborate worlds, scenarios and characters. You've got plenty of inspiration to draw from, and you're desperate to imagine you're literally anywhere else. Tabletop RPGs are apparently quite common in the Slammer and serve much the same purpose as they do on the outside, bringing together friends to share in a common story and overcoming adversity using teamwork and not trying to pickpocket my fucking character every chance they get, Steve. Of course, innocent fun that involves using knives on goblins and not other inmates can seem peculiar for the uninitiated, and so overzealous prison wardens trying to justify their title have banned RPG games and confiscated any gaming paraphernalia, even confusing game maps with escape plans. The most famous example of this was a 2004 lawsuit against the Walpen Correctional Institution by prisoner Kevin T. Singer, who's away for a wee while after rolling a nat 20 while using a sledgehammer on his sister's boyfriend. The prison was primarily concerned with the gang-like activity they perceived to be present within D&D, as the routine meeting of a group of players with a dungeon master supposedly mimicked the organisation and hierarchy of actual gangs. Of course, the prison had no evidence of D&D leading to any actual gang activity in their prison or at any other prison or, well, anywhere at all, ever, really. As anyone who spent their weekends in high school playing video games instead of getting drunk and kissing girls on the mouth hole will tell you, gaming was likely keeping these prisoners out of trouble, if anything. After all, there's hardly time to spend getting into real fights if the precious few hours you have out of your cell each day are spent bartering with the town blacksmith to get a discount on a new warhammer. Still, the appeals court was surprisingly not interested in giving inmates the tools to help rehabilitate themselves, instead of just perpetually punishing them and guaranteeing an endless supply of repeat offenders. And the D&D ban was upheld by the appeals court in 2010. Even in prisons where D&D isn't banned, blanket bans on gambling often leave dice at a scarcity, but creative inmates aren't ones to lie down when the man tells them they can't fling fireballs with the boys. Dice have been made from everything, from toilet paper to the stickers from shampoo bottles, and gamers in the gulag often have dice templates sent in from their people on the outside so that they can easily remake them if a set is taken or destroyed by guards. Even more creative inmates have used everything from spinners to pulling numbers from a cup to using playing cards, which aren't banned for some reason. And my personal favourite, a pair of styrofoam cups that the DM spins until you tell them to stop. Don't ever take for granted the fact that you can just go, "Hey Siri, you dribbling dick of a woman, you fucking dumb bitch, you stupid broad. Could you please roll a d20 for me?"
20.
Not many people know this, but the medieval fantasy setting of Dungeons & Dragons was actually based on the medieval fantasy setting that people were living in the 1980s. And what medieval society would be complete without the constant fear of demonic influence brainwashing the youth? Not to be confused with the religious influence brainwashing the adults.
But they'd take the pieces of the game, they would throw them in the incinerator or the fireplace, and screams would come out because there seemed to be some kind of spiritual forces inhabiting those pieces, and children would drop out of life. They didn't want to study anymore.
On June 9th, 1982, 16-year-old D&D player Irving Pulling committed suicide. His story sadly echoes that of Egbert, an intelligent yet disturbed youth whose interest in Dungeons & Dragons somehow superseded his status as a social outcast with sociopathic tendencies as the root of his problems. Soon after, his mother Patricia Pulling founded the organisation BAD, short for Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons, which is a very mild name for the thing you blame your child's death on. You see, Patricia had rolled a nat 1 while investigating the game, and didn't think that it had caused Irving to fall in with the wrong crowd or something. She thought the game had literally put a curse on him. Possibly as a coping mechanism, Patty P became obsessed with the notion that Satanism was an ever-present concern, seducing the youth of America with gaming. Patricia Pulling wasn't content with just Patricia pulling this shit in some local newspaper or her church group either, and through sheer determination as well as lack of an actual hobby like Dungeons & Dragons, she managed to weasel her way into positions where she could actively ruin other people's lives. These included becoming a consultant to law enforcement, who she kindly provided a profile for teenagers who could potentially be involved in Satanism, which was so vague and open-ended that it essentially describes every teenager. Mrs. Pulling even managed to fit 2 lies into her title at once, when she was brought on as an expert witness for several D&D related court cases. One such case was the trial of D&D playing murderer Darren Molitor, where she was brought in to explain to the jury how Dungeons & Dragons works, which would be like getting a Dungeons & Dragons player in to explain to the jury where to find the clitoris. It's here, by the way. It seems even Patricia knew she was full of shit, as her organisation would consistently fudge statistics, crop articles, and otherwise twist whatever words they could to fit their narrative. Even the newspaper article regarding her own son's death was gone over with the hedge clippers before making its way into BAD's official publications. removing the quote from one of his classmates that noted he had a lot of problems anyway that weren't associated with the game. She even created these pamphlets to help misinformed school staff and law enforcement, which admittedly go pretty hard. So I printed them on the finest t-shirtiesta fabric, featuring all your favorite characters. Deez, nuts. Joe, mama. Bofa, D's nuts. And Sagondi's nuts for the third time. That's not all, we have these other things too. It's just merch. Wear it or burn it for warmth, I don't really care. This video is probably going to get limited ads because I'm talking about some touchy subjects, so any support would be greatly appreciated. Okay, sport, good chat. Between Patricia's kooky crusade and the media storm drummed up by William Dare's hypothesis on the Egbert case, you might think that Dungeons & Dragons was being dealt a 1-2 punch that they would struggle to recover from. Of course, these scandals were essentially the largest free marketing campaign for what was until then a relatively niche hobby. Right before the steam tunnel incident, the basic set might have sold 5,000 copies a month. By the end of 1979, it was trading over 30,000 copies a month, and only going up from there. Unsurprisingly, teenagers aren't ones to heed the entertainment recommendations of their church-going elders, who presumably wanted them to spend their days staring at a wall, and being told that there's this kick-awesome game full of demons and witchcraft and fantasy battles that you definitely shouldn't check out isn't quite the deterrent they thought it would be. In the end, Patricia Pulling only ever helped advertise Dungeons & Dragons. Her organisation BAD effectively disbanding in 1997 following her death, after she presumably received a curse while playing a game of Uno. Anyone who's slung icosahedron with the gang before has almost certainly encountered some version of that guy. These people willfully ignore the collaborative aspect of Dungeons & Dragons and instead set out to create Dickweed Dan's amazing main character syndrome adventure, starring all these assholes who take forever to do their turns when I could be playing instead. Tabletop RPGs can be a unique litmus test for friendships, in the same way that moving in together or trying heroin can bring out undesirable qualities from otherwise reasonable people. Well, this is all well and good for a small friend group, but what about when your D&D playgroup is routinely broadcast to the entire world for millions to see? Such was the case with Critical Role. For those who have been living under a stone golem, Critical Role is a weekly game of Dungeons & Dragons, played by a number of professional voice actors and broadcast on Twitch and YouTube. It's essentially the world's most famous game of Dungeons & Dragons, with their Dungeon Master, Matt Mercer, considered the gold standard that Dungeon Masters the world over are forever trying to suckle at the storytelling teat of. These days, Critical Role is a titan of a show, with Matt and his 7 players topping the highest earning Twitch accounts over the course of their second campaign. Of course, the reason I'm even talking about any of this is that they actually started with 8 players. During their first campaign, the crew were joined by fellow voice actor Orion Akaba, famous for his role as Rico Rodriguez in Just Cause 4. Additional voices, voice, in the Lego Movie video game, and of course, Tiberius Stormwind, his character in Critical Role. Tiberius was a dragonborn sorcerer, a powerful spellcaster and bombastic character who won over the fanbase early on. However, with a bit of hindsight in our post-9/11 world, it's easy to see that Orion began to slip into the usual trappings of being their version of that guy. One of his most infuriating habits was metagaming. And here's where the distinction between Dungeons & Dragons being a game and a storytelling experience really become apparent. Metagaming is where you utilize real-life information to influence choices that your character should have no way of knowing. In almost any other game, coming prepared for a fight would earn you the praise of your teammates, but in D&D, googling the Yandere dev monster to discover that it's weak to mild criticism undermines the experience for everyone else and destroys the immersion that your dungeon master is trying so hard to build. Tiberius was apparently clairvoyant and would nip out for a smoke during fights against monsters that were resistant to his spells, or conveniently summon the one thing that would counter a creature, none of which Tiberius could know. This stemmed from Orion's belief that the DM is more of an adversary to be outwitted as opposed to a storytelling umpire. If metagaming is in the woodlands outside the castle of cheating, fudging dice rolls is sitting atop the cheating throne and subjugating the local townsfolk. And Orion was just as happy to lie about his dice rolls if it meant that Tiberius got to be 4% more of a Mary Sue. There were several situations where it appears that he either re-rolled unfavourable dice or changed them with his hand after they had landed, requiring the other members to literally watch his rolls in later episodes to make sure he wasn't cheating.
I'm not gonna count that. Oh, I'll count that. 19.
Why didn't you count it?
Because it flew out of my hand. I didn't roll it.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Ironically, these attempts to make his character cooler only made them more unlikable, and this sort of behaviour would get you kicked out of any D&D table in a Las Vegas casino. These bad habits were partially attributed to Orion being afflicted with main character syndrome, where a player believes they're playing a single player RPG, where their character is the star and constantly deserving of the limelight, and all these other guys are just here to alley-up them some slam dunks. There were times when he would swoop in and try and steal the thunder from a cool moment that another player was experiencing.
Pass another pillar that just barely manages to miss it by a segment.
I cast telekinesis to swoop it up. God. Just to help it guide it.
Let me just see if I got it first.
And whatever this is.
As Vex is saying this, Tiberius is getting a half chub.
A what?
Hey.
Well, that's just weird.
You can't see it because it's inside.
Yeah, because you said it out loud. So.
Anyway.
As well as an infamous incident where he blew up at a fan who made a t-shirt based on his character, requiring other cast members to step in and apologise. Episode 27, Orion's final episode, is notably the most uncomfortable in the series, with the usually chipper cast deflated and smelly. The following episode, Orion is conspicuously absent, with Matt filling in as his character Tiberius, who has conveniently decided to go off on his own for a few episodes. Several episodes later, Tiberius, still played by Matt, shows up one last time to announce that he's leaving for good.
I have to go now. My planet needs me.
Following this in-game send-off, as well as official confirmation that Orion would no longer be joining, the crit role fandom, or critters, became overrun with rampant speculation. Given the vagueness of the official statement, fans began trawling through previous episodes, social media accounts, and forum posts from the crew to try and pinpoint exactly what could have caused the split. In 2017, over a year after leaving the show, Orion made a now deleted Instagram post explaining, in his own words, why he left. According to him, it came down to focusing on his mental and physical health, as he was battling both cancer and depression during his time on Critical Role. Of course, his departure happened immediately following the infamous 27th episode and his spat with the fan on Twitter, so it's possible that his health wasn't the only reason for his retirement. Following his departure, Orion retained the rights to the character of Tiberius and went on to make the radio show he had always wanted to, where Tiberius is the main character and gets loads of chicks and is super cool and has all the powers of Sonic but is more powerful than Sonic, and but they're also best friends. And ironically, because of this IP retention, Tiberius has effectively been scrubbed from most retellings of Campaign 1, including the upcoming animated series. Orion has since had a somewhat tumultuous couple of years, supposedly misusing funds from a Kickstarter campaign he launched for his Tiberius radio show, his backers never receiving any of the rewards they paid for. There are also allegations surrounding him spending money from multiple charity streams on himself, as well as some very disturbing messages shared by ex-partners which paint him out to be an abusive boyfriend. These, many scandals of Orion have resulted in discussions surrounding him outside of his appearance on the show, being blacklisted from some of the major Crit Role fan groups, such as Facebook and Reddit. To this day, the cast of Critical Role have commented next to nothing on the situation, save for confirming that Orion won't be returning to the show, and some super sleuths noticing Matt liking a few tweets condemning Orion's recent actions. Critical Role, meanwhile, continued on their gradual rise to fame, the crew now raking in massive viewership on both Twitch and YouTube, with the aforementioned animated series premiering early next year and their third campaign currently underway. In the end, it appears that Orion's role really wasn't that critical after all. After more mini-scandals, you can choose between World of Warcraft scandals or Magic the Gathering scandals. See if you can guess which one has the sweatier fanbase. Are there any D&D scandals you'd like to see me cover in a part 2?